Okay, welcome back to World History. This is lesson number 4, and I'm going to put a timer on this. So this is probably going to be a little bit longer one. So if you need to break it up, go ahead and break it up. It's also going to be one of the harder ones because there's some tougher information to go through here. Maybe a little bit more emotional information for the videos that we're going to watch. For this week, we're going to have this video. And then we'll have one more. And the one more is you're pretty much just going to watch a part of Ken Burns and how he describes what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, or the Tonkin Gulf Resolution in 1964. But hopefully you're all doing well. You guys have been doing great, and hopefully we're not overworking you. But this is going to be kind of the last big video for this week. You do have a quiz with this video. So get on Google Classroom. It should be posted on Thursday evening. Tomorrow's video, you'll have no homework, but I will put the option out for a Zoom conference at a later time if you guys so choose to attend. And once again, we're going to try to be a little bit more organized with our Zoom conference of, first 10 minutes addressing questions on homework, next 10 minutes questions on Vietnam. I'm waiting on my education license from Zoom to come so we don't get cut off at the half-hour mark. But there is a quiz for this video, so let's go. Okay, so when we left our last video, we were looking at how ZM had become the leader and had kind of challenged what we would consider to be the Geneva Accords, and how he was eventually becoming a very big challenge for our leadership of President Eisenhower to work with. So before we go on, we need to remind ourselves of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Remember that Vietnam was a colony of the French, and the United States in 1950 under President Truman sent advisors to Vietnam. Understand that word, advisors. No combat troops. We are sending advisors. First, we send it to assist the French, and then after the Geneva Accords, we're sending our soldiers to help President Diem and the South Vietnamese, or what we would call the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam. So no combat troops. We have advisors. Our job is we're to assist and we are to train. We are not to fight. And that is the statement of the United States. And that is how we are trying to prevent the spread of communism from 1950 to 1960 in Vietnam. So that's for President Truman. That's all the way through President Eisenhower. And now in 1960, we'll see the presidency of John F. Kennedy. And the thought behind this is that if South Vietnam was going to choose their own government, they have to win the war for themselves. The problem that the United States runs into more in the 1960s is that South Vietnam politically was a mess. The government was unstable. They're going to have a lot of different coups. And Vietnam is not going to be a stable government. And the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, even though they're being trained by the United States, they don't want to fight. And since they don't want to fight, it becomes a very difficult cause for the United States. Now, our presidents, reminders, they have these options. Our president, so JFK, 1961, when he becomes our president, he has one option. That option is to retreat. Well, if you retreat, you allow communism to spread. And we know that that's not going to be an option in the Cold War with the domino theory. So he decides that we're going to stay involved. And that's what Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, they're all going to have to make that decision on their own to stay involved, because we are committed to the goal of containing communism. Vietnam, though, is a mess. Oh, why do we not want to have combat troops? We are fearful of China. And we've talked about it this year. Don't go to war with China. In Vietnam, it becomes difficult because South Vietnam, if their hearts and their minds, the minds of the people, if they weren't into the fighting, how do you judge progress? Well, politically, and in most governments, you judge progress by how much land you've taken, how many casualties you've had compared to your opponent's casualties. So progress in Vietnam eventually becomes very, very difficult because land and casualties, it doesn't matter a lot if you don't have the mind and hearts of the people. And that's what President Diem failed to do. Is he was never able to win over the hearts of the people of South Vietnam, mostly because he was not in touch with them. A reminder that he's Roman Catholic and the majority of the population is Buddhist. And Diem eventually becomes very corrupt, and we'll discuss that later on in this lesson. But Vietnam, once again, it's not a traditional war. This is guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong, it's guerrilla warfare. The communists don't have uniforms. You can't identify them until they're attacking you. And it becomes a very, very difficult task for the South Vietnamese army, even though they're advised by American generals. A reminder, last video, we said that JFK was elected. He wins the election over Richard Nixon, who was the vice president. And he had a struggle at the beginning of his presidency. You know, Bay of Pigs was a failure. He's trying to deal with Nikita Khrushchev. The Berlin Wall was built. And a lot of Americans are paying no attention to Vietnam, mostly because at home, we have the civil rights movement. That means desegregation of schools, Martin Luther King Jr. becoming very involved. We have the marches. And the civil rights movement in the 1960s has most of the attention of the American people, especially at the beginning of the 1960s. In Vietnam, in North Vietnam, we have the communists. Now, Ho Chi Minh, he was considered to be by most a very patient man, but his assistants were not. And his assistants kept calling for violence against Diem's government in South Vietnam. So North Vietnam, we have communism that's starting to grow. And in South Vietnam, we almost have a civil war between the Viet Cong, who are fighting guerrilla warfare, against Diem's government. A reminder that Ho Chi Minh took the name Uncle Ho, so that way he would be considered an elderly individual, grew the beard to look older, and he's considered to be a friend of the people. At the same time, Diem is losing the favor of the people. In 62, Ho Chi Minh travels to China, and he tells Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, it's inevitable that the United States is going to get involved. And a reminder that Mao Zedong had been involved in Korea. When General MacArthur crosses the Yalu River, he becomes involved in Korea. So China promises to help North Vietnam, and they both believe that it was inevitable that the United States would send combat troops that way. But that's a very important ally for Ho Chi Minh, who once again is fighting an unconventional war of guerrilla warfare. In South Vietnam, in the early 1960s, we have a hamlet program. Now, what this means is that farmers that are in rural communities are going to be moved into more dense communities that become known as hamlets. You can see they have a wall, they have a moat, and eventually they'll be protected, they'll be fortified. So we'll have small communities that are forced to live close to each other. The idea for this is that if there's a wall and a moat, they're eventually going to be protected from outsiders. And in South Vietnam, this is Ngo Diem Nhu, the brother of Ngo Diem, and he eventually is controlling most of the government. And this is his idea. It's an idea that the French used previously, so outsiders had used this. But the idea is to keep the Viet Cong out. It doesn't work. The Viet Cong eventually get in, and they play to the emotions of the people that had to move there. And they tell the farmers, you know, you've been forced to move in this area. If you become a member of the Viet Cong, you can turn your grief into action against Diem. We promise that Diem's going to be thrown out. We promise that the Americans or any foreigners are going to be thrown out. Reminder, this is a country that was controlled by the French before World War II. And then it was controlled by the Japanese during World War II. And then the British after World War II. And then the French come back in. And now the Americans are coming in. So the Viet Cong play to the emotions of removing foreigners. And they also promise the people of the hamlets economic and social justice, and economic social justice in the way of the communist state. Below Nhu, this is his wife. You're going to hear some quotes from her a little bit later, but she eventually becomes a pretty controversial individual in this whole lesson. In these hamlets, the Viet Cong got in. So when the Viet Cong did get in, the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, would go in and try to clear the communists out. Well, here's the issue. How do you identify a communist? They don't wear uniforms. They don't always say what they believe politically. So the only way you identify a communist in this war is once they start firing at you. And that's one of the big challenges of Vietnam. It's the same thing that we discussed with the war on terror. How do you identify a terrorist? They commit a terrorist act. So the United States advisors and the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, go through these hamlets and they try to clear communism out. But what starts to happen is that many believe that the wrong people were killed and that the wrong hamlets were eventually taken over. Here's a quick clip from Ken Burns.
People used to joke in Vietnam about winning the hearts and minds, and you hear that expression. But that should not be a joke. It's a serious problem. If you pull off a military operation, and it may be successful on the military basis, but you destroy a village, and then you've created a village of resistance.
So that's one of the great challenges of the Vietnam War, is if you go into these hamlets and you try to remove communism, are you really going to be able to find the Viet Cong? Because they're not wearing uniforms. They're not easy to find. And remember, in World War II, we had all those tunnels that were being built. They're using those tunnels at this time as well. So as he mentioned, do we get to the hearts and minds of the people, or do we win military battles, and does land and casualties matter? And that's why Vietnam is such an interesting war. Diem is seen as a pretty controversial leader. Once again, his brother New had most of the leadership. And here's a quote that was in Ken Burns' video about Diem. And this is from a citizen of South Vietnam. He didn't lead. He controlled. Meaning it's not a democracy. He's not giving power to the people. He's taking all control, meaning that he's a dictator. And in being a dictator, that's not what they expected. If you didn't agree with Diem or his brother, you're likely exiled. You're likely executed. And once again, his wife has a couple of controversial statements to the American press. She states, Vietnam has no use for your crazy freedoms. And she also states that the Americans are false brothers. The Diem regime is becoming corrupt. They're not listening to the advisors from the United States, to the point that JFK actually threatens to remove all advisors from Vietnam. On January 2nd, 1963, it's an important part of Vietnam because this is the first time that the Viet Cong had become truly aggressive, and now that they're confident that they can defeat the United States. At this battle, just southeast of Saigon, 5 helicopters are destroyed. 15 helicopters were used in this mission to protect a hamlet and remove communism out of that hamlet. 14 of those helicopters were shot, 14 of the 15. 4 American advisors were killed. Many more ARVN were killed. And it shows that the mission between the American advisors and the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Republican Army, it's not going well because they're not communicating well and they're not following each other. By the spring of 1963, Diem had become clear, had become very corrupt. And with this corruption eventually led to a religious confrontation. And we're going to watch a little bit more of Ken Burns for this religious confrontation.
When Halberstam and Sheehan reported that APBAC had in fact been a defeat, the U.S. commander in the Pacific denied it all and urged the reporters to get on the team.
APBAC was terribly important. They'd shot down 5 helicopters, which they'd previously been terrified of. They'd stopped the armored personnel carriers. They demonstrated to their own people that you could resist the Americans and win.
Lúc đó là cái phong trào sôi nổi lên. Trận nào ác liệt thì cứ noi gương áp bắt giết dọc lòng công. La lên sùm vậy cái phấn khởi cái nó quên đi cái sợ sệt của địch.
In Hanoi, the Battle of APBAC was seen by Party First Secretary Lê Duẩn and his Politburo allies as evidence of the inherent weakness of the South Vietnamese regime. Even when faced with American advisors and weaponry, the Viet Cong had learned how to inflict heavy casualties on Saigon's forces and get away again. In Saigon, President Diem claimed the ARVN were winning, not losing. APBAC had only been a momentary setback, and he resented Americans telling him how to fight his battles or run his country. The president's sister-in-law, Madame Nhieu, went further. She denounced the Americans as false brothers. We don't have a prayer of staying in Vietnam, President Kennedy privately told a friend that spring. These people hate us, but I can't give up a piece of territory like that to the communists and then get the people to re-elect me.
Buddhist monks and nuns are joined by thousands of sympathizers to protest the government's restrictions on the practice of their religion in South Vietnam.
Diem began by alienating the rural population, and that started the Viet Cong. Now he was alienating the urban population.
70% of the population is Buddhist, and the demonstrators clashed with the police during the week-long series of incidents like this.
In the months that followed the Battle of APBAC, South Vietnam plunged into civil strife that had little to do with the Viet Cong. Religion and nationalism were at its heart. A Catholic minority had for years dominated the government of an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. That spring, in the city of Hue, Christian flags had been flown to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the ordination of Diem's older brother as a Catholic bishop. But when the Buddhists of the city flew their flags to celebrate the 2,527th birthday of Lord Buddha, police tore them down. Protesters took to the streets. The Catholic deputy province chief sent security forces to suppress the demonstration. The soldiers opened fire. 8 protesters died. The youngest was 12. The oldest was 20. The Diem regime blamed the Viet Cong. Monks throughout the country demanded an apology. They also called for an end to discrimination by Catholic officials. Many Buddhists had come to see Diem's policies as a direct threat to their religious beliefs.
My family was against what Diem was doing. My mother was convinced that Diem was destroying the Buddhist faith. She would go to the pagodas and listen to the monks' speeches, and she was just extremely upset. She was not alone. There was a lot of people like her.
American officials urged Diem and his brother Nhieu to make meaningful concessions to the Buddhists for the sake of maintaining unity in the struggle against communism. They refused. On June 10, 1963, Malcolm Brown of the Associated Press received an anonymous tip. Something important was going to happen the next day at a major intersection in Saigon. He took his camera. To protest the Diem regime's repression, a 73-year-old monk named Quang Duc set himself on fire.
Okay, so that's where we're going to stop with that part of the video. But once again, what we see here is that the religious confrontation in 1963 means that the majority of the population is going to turn against Diem. And Diem doesn't back down. And actually, shortly after that, 73-year-old monk burnt himself. Other monks will be in other cities, and they'll pour gasoline on themselves, and they'll commit suicide by burning themselves. They become martyrs. Over 1,400 monks and nuns will go missing, meaning they were taken away, they were arrested, they'll go missing. And these are not the liberties that Diem had promised with democracy. He eventually will enact martial law, meaning that you couldn't go outside, and there's a curfew of 9 p.m. And eventually there's a group in South Vietnam that is wanting to lead a coup. And they asked President Kennedy about this coup. And President Kennedy knows that the United States has been a part of the coup. A reminder that the CIA was part of the coup in 1950, in the 1950s in Iran, when Mohammad Mossadegh, who was going to nationalize oil, was removed and replaced with Mohammad Reza Shah. But we see later on in history that was part of the roots of the Iranian Revolution. President Kennedy is asked about a coup in the fall of 1963 while all this is going on. It had gotten so bad in South Vietnam that even the Catholics were starting to protest against the leadership of Diem. Okay, we're going to watch an interview that President Kennedy was a part of in 1963. I will do my best to stop this video when it needs to be stopped.
November 2nd, 1963, Labor Day, Walter Cronkite of CBS News interviewed President Kennedy. The president used the opportunity to deliver a message to President Diem.
Mr. President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam, and we've got our difficulties there, quite obviously.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war.
Well, hasn't every indication from Saigon been that President Diem has no intention of changing his pattern?
If he doesn't change it, of course, that's his decision. He's been there 10 years. And as I say, he has carried this burden when he's been counted out on a number of occasions. Our best judgment is that he can't be successful on this basis. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake. That'd be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of an effort. 47 Americans have been killed. We're in a very desperate struggle against the communist system. And I don't want Asia to pass into the control of the Chinese.
Do you think that this government still has time to regain the support of the people?
With changes in policy and perhaps with in personnel, I think it can. If it doesn't make those changes, I would think that the chances of winning it would not be very good.
Despite the cable, Kennedy and his advisors were sharply divided about a coup. Robert McNamara, Maxwell Taylor, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and the head of the CIA all cautioned against it. Because while none of them especially admired Diem, they did not believe there was any viable alternative.
Fritz Nolting was called in, and he said, As difficult as they are to deal with, there is nobody with the guts and sang-froid in Vietnam of Diem and his brother Nhu. And if we let them go, we will be saddled by a descending cycle of mediocre generals. And he was absolutely correct.
But several State Department officials believed that without fresh leadership, South Vietnam could not survive. The debate intensified. "My God," the president said, "my administration is coming apart." In the end, Kennedy instructed Lodge to tell the renegade generals that while the United States does not wish to stimulate a coup, it would not thwart one either. The generals laid their plans. On November 1st, 1963, troops loyal to the plotters seized key installations in Saigon and demanded Diem and Nhu surrender.
The battle for the city went on for 18 hours, and most of it was centered on the presidential palace. Just after 6:30 in the morning Saturday, the shooting ceased.
Diem and Nhu escaped, took sanctuary in a church, and agreed to surrender to the rebels in exchange for the promise of safe passage out of the country.
Diem and his brother eventually work with the ARVN to come pick them up and save them. As they stepped into essentially an armored vehicle that would move people from a group that they thought were their allies, they were both shot and killed on the morning of November 2nd, 1963. When President Kennedy thought of the coup, he thought more of an overthrow. He didn't really think of assassination. And we're going to watch a clip here that it appears that there's quite a bit of regret in President Kennedy's voice.
Was not so sure. He was appalled that Diem and Nhu had been killed. 3 days later, he dictated his own rueful account of the coup and his concerns for the future.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of August in which we suggested the coup. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference. I was shocked by the death of Diem and Nhu. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals can stay together and build a stable government, or whether public opinion in Saigon will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not-too-distant future.
Kennedy would not live to see the answer to the question he had asked. He was murdered in Dallas 18 days later. There were now 16,000 American advisors in South Vietnam. Their fate, and the fate of that embattled country, rested with another American president, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Okay, that's where we're going to stop today. So the presidency has changed from Truman to Eisenhower, from Eisenhower to Kennedy, and now Kennedy has died on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas. And on Air Force One, we see President Johnson here being sworn in. Told you a couple of times when I went to Dayton, I could stand on that spot. So where that photograph is taken, I've had my photograph taken, and it's a very somber thing to think about, the death of our president. 1963, leadership has changed. That means that the perspective in Vietnam has also changed. And President Johnson, he's going to do some stuff in Vietnam. And his view of no ground troops that Kennedy had is not exactly what Johnson will have. And when we come back for video 5, we'll watch a lot more of this Ken Burns documentary, Vietnam War, and we'll learn a little bit more about President Johnson. All right, have a great day. Love you all. Be safe. Wash your hands. And I'm going to go walk my dog. All right, have a good day.